Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 3, Halacha 5 in the Art Scroll 32b1. When I reviewed this Mishnah and this Halacha, at first I was so confused because it looks like it contradicts a lot of the things that we've been talking about with spacing, setbacks, and when I reviewed this again and again, and reviewed this also with the Mishkiach of the yeshiva, I actually came away from this saying, wow, this is actually secretly genius. This is really just such a brilliant Mishnah and a brilliant case and a brilliant understanding of the deeper parts of the halacha that we have been covering. It's not contradicting it. What it's doing is it's really synthesizing all of the concepts that we've already been getting that are foundational concepts, and now giving you a new situation that is going to look like it challenges the concepts. And it's really like you have to go in through the back door to get into the house. If you try to go in the front door, it's going to look like this doesn't make any sense. It's not going to look like it jives with the other foundational things that we've been doing earlier in chapter 2 and chapter 3 to establish spacing and things like that. So the case is going to go like this. We have already an onion patch. We have an onion field, and it's going to start where it's 2 rows of onions. And the theme that we've been covering is we always have to be in a case, and the Yerushalmi is more careful about this than the Bavli is, where the species are not getting closed in. The middle species that you have is not being closed in by the outer species. And everything that we've been looking at, what is the species that can close in more than anything else? Well, it's going to be rows of gourds, melon plants, also the Egyptian bean. Why? Because these grow on vines. They have very large leaves. We covered this before, that if you have the leaf covering over another vegetable, that could be a problem for Kilayim. Also, we have the tendrils that can grab onto the other plant. That could also make a nullification issue because now it looks like it's intermingled. We also have another problem. The problem is the vines go all over the place. The vines can go into the other field, and now it looks like a mishmash field. This is something that we're trying to avoid. So we are now getting into the case of not like a vegetable field and then you're trying to put a vegetable field next to it. We already covered that. That's a maloket between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Yishmael was saying that you have to create a furrow, and that furrow is going to have to go down the whole length of the row of the field to separate between plant A, plant B, and plant C. Well, we're mixing it up here. We're going back to this row of onions that, the middle species can't be allowed to be closed in. By the way, the halacha is not going to go by Rabbi Yishmael. It's going to go by Rabbi Akiva, where there's going to be a furrow that's going to go into the field to separate between plant A, plant B, and plant C. But it's not going to go down the full length of the row. They both agree how wide it has to be to separate, but the furrow is still going to be coming up. And now what they're doing is they're mixing it up, and they're saying, all right, now we're taking not just a regular vegetable next to a regular vegetable. We're going to take gourds, the thing that is so complicated in the halacha because it has the need to go out and spread out. And that's why you're going to have, different spacing, and you're going to also have different setback issues from regular vegetables. So in the spacing for regular vegetables, to separate between this and that, we're going to have 6 tefachim. But when we're looking at separating between different fields for melons, we see that it can go up to, and this is going to be a maloket, but depending on how you're placing things next to it, it could be up to 12 amos. In some cases, it can be 8 amos. And now the separation between grain and other vegetables is going to be 10.5 amos. So in some cases, it's going to be more strict than for just a regular vegetable and a regular vegetable. So what the sages are going to be doing is they're going to be trying to teach you something with all of these foundational things. But the trick that comes here is you can only understand this if you understand the nature about how onions grow. Onions grow in a way where you're trying to get the bulb. Now, we covered this before, that in some cases, you're going to want the yerok, the green of it. And, we like scallions. Scallions are delicious in cooking, and the greens can be used. So, were onion greens used? Sure, right? You chop them up and you throw them into a stew, and it gives a nice oniony flavor. Certainly the greens have some value. But when you're trying to get the bulb of the onion, then you really are valuing the bulb. And what's unique about the plant, and we covered this before in Masechet Shvius, is that some plants will have two uses to it, or two parts to it. And this is the case over here. We see that with the beet plant. With the beet plant, you can go for the leaves. You can also, after you harvest the leaves, get the beet. There's two parts to it. The same is going to be for the onion, but the trick with the onion is this. The trick is that, and I used to grow onions, and my family used to grow onions in our backyard when we lived in New York. So the trick is that you have to wait before you harvest the bulbs, because you want the bulbs to be usable and you want the onions so that you can cook with it. You have to wait until the greens wilt and they die. You basically are waiting for the greens to fall onto the ground, and it starts to become brown, and you let it sit in the ground for a bit. And after that, then you're going to pull out the bulbs. So basically what you're doing when you're going for the bulb and you're harvesting the bulb is you're basically doing betul on the green. You really can't do both at the same time. You really can't harvest a good quality bulb that's going to be there for long-term storage. It's going to be too wet, and also get the green at the same time. If you do both, you end up with a very small bulb, and it's too wet, and you're not going to be able to dry it out enough so that you can use it for a long-term storage. Now, after you take these bulbs that you've allowed the green to sort of die off and wilt down, basically you're nullifying it. Then what happens is you dig it up and you put it onto racks or a fence and you let them dry out. And basically what happens is it creates this little hard shell around the onion, and then you can have it for a long term, and that's how you do onions. But you really aren't doing both. You're not really taking the green and the bulb at the same time. And that's the secret genius about this, because again, you have a row of onions, and now you're going to say, oh, I want to uproot part of this, onion patch, and I'm going to plant, rows of gourds next to this. And you're going to be able to do this in a way that it's not Kilayim. But the trick about this is not a normal vegetable that it's talking about. It's talking about the onion. And the trick on the onion is that to say, look, in a normal case, if you have a vegetable next to it in this layout and it sort of goes next to this, then, what about the tendrils of the vine or the melon? It can grab onto these things. And you're saying, but wait a second. I've already planted the onions in a kosher way, and by the time I'm harvesting, I've nullified the greens, and I'm not using the greens. I'm not interested in the greens, and I'm only interested in the bulbs. In fact, I'm going to allow the greens to die off, and then I'm going to harvest the bulb. And so the ultimate formulation that's going to be coming up is that you're going to have rows of gourds between this row of onions, these two rows of onions. And effectively, what's going to happen is there's not going to be a setback. There's going to be a mloket if you do need a work area between it. The sages are going to say that no, you're actually going to be able to grow a row of gourds along this row of onions. And you're going to have a work area actually on the outside of this row of gourds and on the outside area of the row of gourds. But effectively, these rows of onions are going to effectively be closed in. So how could that be, right? The only way this can be is because the nature of how you're trying to grow these onions, not for the yerok, but for the bulbs. And so even if the leaves of this are going to sort of come over these yerok onion greens, or you're going to they're going to grab on with the tendrils, or they're sort of spread out over there on the tendrils. Again, you're as a farmer, you've nullified this. You're not trying to grow for the greens. You're trying to grow for bulbs. And I think what the Tanakama is going to basically be saying is that in such a case that you're going to be doing this, it's going to be visually distinctive that you're coming and you're growing it for the bulb. And the other case about this is that when you go back and you look at the Tanakama position that's going to be coming up, it's basically going to be a blank, empty field when you're going to go be harvesting it. So between this row of gourds and the row of gourds, you have these 2 rows of onions. But when you're actually going to be harvesting the onions, these are below ground, and you're going to be digging them out. And, the greens have wilted and browned up, and that's when you know you have a good onion to dig up. And basically, it's going to have the appearance of being a blank field. So you're going to have rows of gourds that could have leaves in this barren area. And, again, the onions are going to be under the ground. We're not talking about seed onions. Seed onions are going to be a little different. Seed onions are going to be, and we covered this in the second paya, when you're going to leave the onion plant for a long term until it flowers and you grow seed out of those flowers. And that's going to be a different stage. But we're dealing here with a stage where you're trying to get the bulb. And other than that, if you were trying to grow lettuce or something like that, and you're trying to grow this would be very problematic to put together and try to understand how you could pull this off. But Rebbe and the sages are talking about rows of onions. And the trick is that you're not harvesting it for the greens, you're harvesting it for the bulb. And I don't think it's accidental that this all comes about. So let's get into the Mishnah. So the Mishnah's case says like this. It says, if one's field was planted with onions and he wished to plant it within rows of gourds, how should he proceed? Again, we're always worried in the Yerushalmi about closing in the center species. And that's something that we looked at before. If you want to try to take a chessboard field and try to maximize how many different things you could grow in a garden plot. Always the problem is you could theoretically plant more, but the problem is it's going to look like Kilayim, and also it's going to have cases where some of the middle patches get closed in. So how do you do this now where you're going to grow this where it's not going to close in and it's not going to get intermingled, and also give the appearance that this is not a mixed field, this is not a mixed planting. So again, you have the onions that have been planted first. You want to rip out some of the onions on the sides and plant in gourds. That's what we're talking about. There are going to be 3 opinions about this, and within the opinions, there's going to be 2 issues within each of these 3 opinions. So there's really 6 things that are going on here. Okay, so the 3 opinions are going to go like this. Rabbi Ishmael, and again, we covered Rabbi Ishmael's point. Okay, Rabbi Ishmael's point is that you're going to have a blank walk area, a working area, a gap, a blank unplanted area between this and that. And we covered this earlier. And he's going to be consistent here. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Ishmael says that he uproots 2 rows of onions. So in other words, he's clearing a space that's going to be 8 amos wide. And he plants 1 row of gourds in this clearing. The Mishnah says that he then leaves standing onions in place in the next 2 rows. And he's going to leave the next 2 rows, in other words, 8 amos of onions growing. And he's going to uproot the following 2 onions. And he's going to plant 1 row of gourds in this clearing as well. Now, basically, this is going to have the same sub-theme of what happens if you want to do this pattern and do it if you had a larger field where you want to just repeat this. Is this going to be repeatable? This is going to be, this repeatable pattern is going to be a sub-theme throughout all 3 opinions. Okay, this is how Rabbi Ishmael is saying it. So Rabbi Ishmael is going to say like this, okay? He's going to say the middle row, that you have to have 2 rows, and it's going to be 8 amos wide for this row. There has to be an unplanted gap that you created that runs along the entire row of the field, and this, by the way, is consistent with what we learned earlier. Now, how wide is this gap going to be? This is going to be 2 amos wide for each of the gap. So in total, when you add up the row of onions plus the gap on each side of the onions that runs along the length of the field, it's going to be 12 amos long. Then he says that you can plant only one row of gourd in the middle. How long is that gourd? That row of gourd. How wide is that going to be? It's only allowed to be 4 tefachim wide. One tefach, by the way, is going to be the width of the hand. And then you want to continue this. Basically, you start again, right? So you create 2 amos wide or 2 tefach wide gap that is going to separate between the row of gourds. Now you have another row of onions. You're going to have 2 rows of onions. That's going to be 8 amos wide. And then you're basically, it's not going to be 2 tefach wide. It's going to be 2 tefach wide, or 2 amos wide. So again, the tefachim is going to, and it's not going to be 4 tefach wide for the gourd. It's going to be 4 amos wide. So basically what's going to happen is you can repeat this pattern, but the basic pattern is going to be like this, that you have a row of gourd, you have a gap, and whatever you have on the other side of the gap, row of onions, right? That's, you have a gap first. Then you have your row of gourds. That's going to be 1 row of gourds. Then you're going to have a gap. Then you're going to have your row of onions in the middle. That was already there, by the way. Then you have a gap. You have your new row of gourds. You have a gap. And then if you want to put rows of onions on either side, you could put onions on either side. Now, the onions were already there. What are you doing in Rabbi Yishmael's case? You're ripping out the onion patch that you had. You're creating 4 sets of gaps, and you're creating 2 sets of rows of gourds. And this is going to be where it's not going to give the appearance of closing it in. And, the width of the row is going to be 4 amos, so that you're basically going to be uprooting, 2 rows of onions. It's going to clear an 8 amos wide gap. How are you getting that, right? So, you have a gap of 2 amos, you have a gap of 2 amos, and you have 1 row of gourds. That's going to add up to 8 amos. And so basically the middle row of onions that you had in the middle is also going to be 8 amos wide. That is the formulation that's consistent with the pattern that Rabbi Yishmael said. He says you need unplanted gaps, and these unplanted gaps have to run the entire length of the field. Let's get into the second opinion. That's going to be Rabbi Akiva. Now, we learned this earlier. Rabbi Akiva is going to be saying that you can take a small furrow, and the furrow is going to be a visual indicator to everyone else walking by that these were not planted this way as a mixture and purpose, that you have a purposeful furrow and gap between the two. And basically what he's going to be saying is that you leave your 2 rows of onions, but you have to do 2 rows of gourds on each side. It's not going to be enough to do 1 row of gourds. That, by the way, is going to be a very lenient opinion. Okay, Rabbi Yishmael's opinion is going to be very strict. He's going to say that you can only do 1 row of gourds, and between the row of gourds, you have to leave unplanted gaps between either sides of the row of gourds. So Rabbi Akiva says like this. It says that he's going to uproot 2 rows of onions, and he's going to plant 2 rows of gourds in the entire 8 amos that he clears. And then he leaves standing onions in place in the middle 2 rows. And then he's going to uproot 2 rows of onions, and he's going to plant 2 rows of gourds in the place, and he can continue this pattern throughout the entire field. So Rabbi Akiva is going to be disagreeing with Rabbi Yishmael on 2 points, and we covered this before. Okay, Rabbi Yishmael says you have to make a clearing gap that runs the entire field to separate between vegetable A, vegetable B, and vegetable C. Rabbi Akiva is saying no, only a furrow that does not run the length of the field is going to be enough. In other words, you do have to make a clearing. There does have to be a gap, according to Rabbi Akiva, but it doesn't need to go the entire length of the field. And you can use the separating things that we've been talking about, like 6 amos, and also, depending on, if it's raised or indented and things like that, how wide is this going to be? And so there's some opinion that, it can be 1.5 amos. It can be 3 amos, depending on Maloket Rishonim. But they're going to agree that, look, it has, or basically the Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva is going to be agreeing that this furrow has to at least be 6 tefachim long, and the exact width of it is going to be a little bit unclear in the halacha. That's a maloket rishonim, but it does have to be significantly wide so that when somebody is walking by, they're going to see that this is not a mixed field. It wasn't intentionally planted as a mixed field, and this is going to be a lenient thing. Now, how could this be if you were planting these rows of gourds next to rows of lettuce, right? Rows of lettuce are going to get all wrapped up in the vines. You're going to have leaves from the melons or gourds that are going to be hanging over the leaves of lettuce, and that can provide a Kilayim problem by itself. So, these vines can be leaning over things, the leaves can be over things, and all of this is going to give a Kilayim problem. But again, we're not talking about lettuce here. We're talking about rows of onions. Now, the Rambam is going to understand that this can actually be for any species of vegetables, not just onions. But according to the Rambam commentary, an onion field is mentioned just as an example because it was common to plant gourds in onion fields. But not everybody is going to agree with that. And in fact, the Chazan Ish is going to be saying that although the Mishnah is speaking about gourds, the discussion could apply to chate melons and Egyptian beans as well. And these are going to be vegetables that are going to spread out and spread extensively, and that it could be that actually is not going to be the Chazan Ish, but it could be that we're talking about onions because that is going to be a different kind of case because the harvesting is going to be different. And so, again, the case is because the harvesting is going to be different. If you have rows of gourds on either side of the onions, they always have to be regarded as independent of each other, and the rows have to be considered to be independent, and there has to be some distance. So what's going on over here? So Rabbi Akiva, and this is from the Rambam commentary, Rabbi Akiva is going to disagree with Rabbi Ishmael on 2 points. First, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is going to be that there's no need to have 2 amos between the onions and the gourds, and this simple furrow that doesn't run the length of it is going to be enough. And second, the distance between the rows and the gourds can be as little as 8 amos without the rows being viewed as united and closing in the onions. That's a big hiddush. Now, the sages are going to be agreeing with Rabbi Ishmael, in fact, that 12 amos is going to be where you have to separate the individual rows of gourds if they're to be viewed in a way where they're not going to be closing in the onions. And if they, don't do it that way, then it's going to, the sages are basically going to be saying that if you introduce a new row of gourds into this onion patch, it's, going to be no different than introducing any other vegetable into a field. And, basically, you can still just use the furrow that Rabbi Akiva was talking about. You don't need a gap that's going to run the length of it. But what they are saying is that the rows of gourds themselves, the distance between, for these onions, has to still be 12 amos wide. So they're basically going to be taking the position between both of them. The position of Rabbi Ishmael is saying that, look, between the row of gourds, and it's, by the way, 1 row of gourds for Rabbi Ishmael, and the Tanakama agree with that. They're going to say that you can only plant 1 row of gourds on either side of the onions. Rabbi Ishmael is being careful, not even being careful, it's being more strict in saying there has to be an unplanted gap. Can't be fully utilized. It has to run through the whole length of this. And by the way, when you add up the gap and you add up the middle row of onions, this is going to create 12 amos. Why do you have 12 amos between this and that? because when you're harvesting it, it's barren, right? Because you're trying to get the bulb under the ground. You've done betul on the green. So you have this 12 almost gap between the rows of gourds, and we were talking about that, right? We talked about this before. If you have a row of gourds and you have a row of gourds over here, how far does the spacing have to be? It's going to have a different spacing of 12 amos. We covered this before. So when you're actually going to be harvesting this, it's going to be a blank field. And, what's the distance going to be between this row of gourds and the row of gourds that you've newly planted? 12 amos, consistent with what we've learned. But it's only because of how they're harvesting this. That is going to be my observation from actually growing onions as a kid and actually trying to dry them out. And again, you don't do this early. You don't pick the onions early, and you're not trying to pick the onions for the greens necessarily, because you can buy scallions in the store. Although the onion greens do have some use as yerok, but again, scallions are better. So the Tanakama is going to be agreeing with Rabbi Yishmael on 2 points. Okay, they're going to be saying that, look, that you have to have one row of gourds on either side, and you still have to have 12 amos for the row of onions. But what does that mean? That means that you're really doing 3 rows of onions. And so they're basically saying that your onion field can be fully planted, and basically you don't need this gap running along the whole side of it. You can use Rabbi Akiva's furrow, no problem. But where they disagree with Rabbi Akiva is they say that, look, Rabbi Akiva says that you can have 2 rows of gourds that are now planted on either side of the onions. And they're saying, no, you can't do that, because now in this patch, you've limited your middle 2 rows of onions to only being 8 amos wide. Clearly, one of the furrows is going to be 4 amos wide. And they're saying, look, you can plant where it's going to be alongside the row of gourds. It can be touching up without a gap, without this unplanted gap that Rabbi Yishmael is talking about. But you have to plant 3 rows of onions, or leave them planted. So your row of gourds is going to be 4 amos wide, and you can only do one of it. That's going to be in agreement with Rabbi Yishmael. But the Chiddush, the new point that Tanakama is saying, is going to be that this row of onions has to be bigger, and has to be a total of 12 amos wide between this row of gourds and that row of gourds. That is not anything new that we've learned, right? We've learned that if you're going to plant this melon and that melon, you have to have a gap. Why is there going to be a gap? Because when you're harvesting the onions, the field is barren, right? You don't have where it's going to be there. You're nullifying this. You're not desiring the green. Now, the opinion the Mishnah says is like this. Says the sages say if there are no 12 amos space between one row of gourds and its neighbor, one may not retain the onion plants in between them. In other words, sages agree with Rabbi Yishmael that 12 amos has to separate the individual rows of gourds, and that's going to be so that they're not viewed as closing in the onions. But they do not accept the position that the furrow is going to be ineffective at separating a row of gourds from onions. The sages are basically saying, like Rabbi Akiva, that a row of gourds that you're now introducing into an onion field is no different than introducing any other vegetable into that field, and this furrow is going to be enough. So there's no gap that runs the length of the field like what Rabbi Yishmael says. So the law, by the way, is going to be where this furrow only has to be 6 tefachim. We covered this before in the Mishnah, and that's the halacha, that's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And the sages give the distance as being 12 amos because they measured the distance between the rows of gourds at points not opposite the furrow. So, where they're looking at the edge of they're looking at the edge of where the onion field is going to meet the gourd field. They're not looking at the 12 amos being from the edge of the furrow to the edge of the furrow. That might be something that Rabbi Yishmael may do. Now, let's get into the Gemara, and it's a very short Gemara. So the Gemara is going to understand Rabbi Yishmael's point differently, and I just want to point out that to summarize all of this that's going to be coming up, that this Mishnah is recording these three opinions. And again, the case is where you have an onion field already, and you're trying to introduce gourds, but as the Chazan Ish points out, it could also be the Egyptian bean, it could be melons, and it's going to deal with two issues. The issue is going to be the distance between the gourd patch you're doing and the gourd patch. There's two opinions. It's either going to be 8 amos. That, by the way, is going to be the position of Rabbi Akiva, or it's going to be 12 amos. That's the opinion of the sages and also Rabbi Yishmael. Then you have the second case. And this, by the way, is to prevent the gourds from looking like it's closed in on the onions. The second case is going to be the space between the gourds and the onions. Rabbi Yishmael is going to be saying there has to be an unplanted work area, you could walk on it and water the adjacent things like that. And there has to be something that's left unplanted. That's going to figure into the width of the distance given between this row of gourds and that row of gourds. But Rabbi Yishmael's point is going to be there has to be a length that, this unplanted gap that runs alongside of it. And the second case is going to be like what Rabbi Akiva says and what the sages agree with, which is a simple furrow that's at least 6 tefachim is going to be enough. It has to be a certain distance wide. That's going to be the exact distance is going to be a Maloket Rishonim. But the issue is going to be that this row of onions is actually, on a lot of it, can be touching the row of gourds. Actually can be planted right next to it without this walk area or work area of an unplanted gap that runs between it. So you have these three cases, and Rabbi Yishmael is going to be saying, according to Kana that's going to be coming up, that for issue A, that's going to be the distance between this patch and that patch, that the gourd patches have to be separated from each other by 8 amos, and then when you're adding in the walking area or the work area, it's going to be adding up to 12 amos. And also, the distance for part B of how wide are you going to be spacing the gourds and the onions in the patch themselves. Well, he's going to be saying that you have to have at least 2 amos of an unplanted work area. The next case is going to be Rabbi Akiva, and again, Rabbi Akiva is going to be saying that the gourd patch has to be separated from each other by only 8 amos instead of the 12 amos. And he says that the furrow is enough. And the sages are going to say that the gourd patches have to have a separation between gourd patch A and gourd patch B of 12 amos. And that you can have the furrow that Rabbi Akiva talked about. Those are the three cases. So Kana says like this, and again, very short, and only take a couple of minutes to finish this up. Kana says like this in this Gemara. It says, in the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, at times the gourd patches will be separated from each other by 16 amos, and other times by 12 amos, and other times by 8 amos. And Kana is going to elaborate. In the Bavli, by the way, it's Rav Kana. Here in the Yerushalmi, a lot of times it's just called Kana. It's the same person. So the Gemara is going to say he elaborates, and it says that if one place, the entire 4 amma work area, the unplanted gap of the gourds toward the inside of the field, then you're going to have 16 amos that will separate between successive gourd patches. In other words, that you could have 16 amos that are going to be intervening between gourd patches in the following case. If you have 2 rows, in other words, 8 amos of onions that are cleared on each side of the onion patch, then the farmer planted a single row of 4 amos of gourds on either side of the clearings, and he placed them along far side of the clearing so that all 4 amos left for the gourd's work area are going to be toward the inside of the field. And then the distance between the gourd rows is going to be 16 amos. You have 4 amos for a clearing, 8 amos for the onions, and 4 amos for a clearing. That's going to be what Rabbi Ishmael says according to him. Gemara says that if he places, and again, this is just going to finish up right real quick, it says that if he places some of the work area toward the inside of the field and some of it toward the outside, then the gourds are going to be located in the middle of the 8 amos of cleared onions with 2 amos of spacing on either side. And then you'll have where 12 amos will separate between the gourd strips. And by the way, he's saying that you can only do 1 row of gourds. Tanakama agrees with that. Only 1 row of gourds, not 2. So if he places the entire unplanted work area toward the outside of the field, then you could have where 8 amos will intervene between the successive rows of gourds. So 12 amos is going to intervene between successive rows where he plants the gourds in the center of the 8 amma clearing, and he leaves 2 ammas of unplanted space on either side. So why is he leaving 2 ammas on either side? Okay, well, basically what they're saying, he's saying, look, he's going to be starting a new row of onions, and he's going to be starting this cycle again. So you could have a case where, between this row of gourds over here and this row of gourds over here, you're going to have, the gourds down the center. That's going to be 8 amos in a clearing, and it's going to leave 2 amos, in unplanted space on each side. And, basically it's going to be finishing up and saying that, after clearing 8 amos on either side, he plants gourds right up alongside the growing onions and places the entire 4 amos on the outside of the field. And that's how he's getting this sort of arrangement. In other words, according to this reading of Kana, he's not leaving this gap running alongside between the onions and the gourds at all. He takes all of the unplanted gap and puts it on the outside row of gourds. And then what happens is the row of gourds and the row of onions are touching up against each other. What's the separation between this row of gourds and that row of gourds? In that formulation, it's only going to be 8 amos. And so basically, Kana is playing with the work area, combining the work area of this unplanted strip and putting it all on the outside. And he's basically going to be repeating the pattern to plant, gourds and onions again. But this is this one little plot. Shmuel is going to dissent to that. He's going to say that 12 amos is always required between gourd patches, according to Rabbi Ishmael. Gemara is going to support Rabbi Shmuel's statement. It says that it was taught in Baraisa, the distance between adjacent gourd patches is fixed according to both opinions. Rabbi Ishmael says it's 12 amos. Rabbi Akiva says it's 8 amos. And the Gemara now is going to challenge Shmuel's opinion. It says, but if so, Rabbi Ishmael says that 12 amos of separation is required, and the rabbis in the Mishnah also say that 12 amos are required. So what's the difference between them? And the Gemara answers, says the difference between them exists in placing the gourds alongside the onions. In the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael, it is prohibited to place alongside the onions. But the rabbis say that it is permitted to place them alongside the onions. So again, according to Shmuel's reading, right? Shmuel is saying that when Rabbi Ishmael stated this Mishnah, he's saying that one plants a row of gourds. He meant that you have to have an unplanted gap between the row of gourds and the row of onions. And Kana is playing with it. Kana is saying that no, perhaps Rabbi Ishmael says that you can actually leave, the unplanted area on the outside of the gourds, and the gourds can touch the row of onions. So the question arises that, according to Shmuel, who maintains that Rabbi Ishmael always says that you have to have 12 amos difference, that, it's not feasible to do it. In other words, Shmuel is saying, no, Rabbi Ishmael means there always has to be 12 amos, and you can't add up to 12 amos without the gap between the onions and the gourds. And Kana is saying that no, the disagreement here is where the sages are saying that you can plant right alongside of the onions, and Rabbi Yishmael is requiring a separation of only 8 amos, and it's actually going to be the sages that are going to be saying the 12 amos. That's going to be Kana's reading of it. And so the way he's reading it, he's saying that, look, in the geometry, you can get 8, and Rabbi Yishmael is saying 8. They say that the work area can be 4 on the outside. And it's the sages that are saying that there has to always be 12. And the way that you're getting 12 is that you're having a bigger patch of onions, and that the bigger patch of onions is going to add up to 12. And that, according to Kana, he's saying that Rabbi Yishmael is saying that you can have a smaller patch of onions, and that can only be where you only need 8. So this is going to finish up and saying, according to Rabbi Yishmael, and this is the dissent, and this is the Vilna Goan explaining it, but according to the Vilna Goan to explain it, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the gourds need to be planted in the center of the 8 amma clearing so that there'll be only 2 amos of empty space between the gourds and the onions. And according to the sages, the only important thing here is that there has to be 12 amos between the new gourd patch and the new gourd patch on the other side of it. And those 12 amos can even be completely planted with onions so that the gourds and the onions grow alongside of each other with just this furrow separation. So it's unclear whether the sages require that the work area for amos are going to be left on the other side of the gourds, or whether they don't subscribe to the notion of leaving the work area at all. That's unclear. But the Tanakhama is saying that, look, you have to always have 12, and they're always saying that you have to have a bigger patch of onions. You can't do it with the smaller 8 amma gap, and that's not going to be enough. So a lot going on here, and I think that, again, it's using onions because these are harvested in a different way. And, again, you're doing batul on the green part. You don't value the green part, and you're waiting for it, in fact, to die off. You've nullified it, and you're not deriving any value off of it because you're trying to get the bulb, which is underground, and you can only harvest it when it wilts and starts to brown up. And when the greens are browned up and wilted, that's when you leave them there for a little bit, and then you dig them up, and that's going to be the best bulb. And I think that is why this is in here. Anyway, have a great day, and we're going to get into Halacha 6 tomorrow.